Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And I have got an excellent guest on today. Her name is Liza Libes. So she is a writer and she writes a wonderful Substack and she has her own YouTube channel called Pens and Poison. So I came across her content and she was talking all about how modern academia and English literature has become very woke, which is no shock to most of us here. And yeah, we're all about talking about, the problems with wokeism and mainly anti-feminism, but we're going to be talking a lot about woke ideology today. So I'm really happy to have this guest on. And for those who don't know, I am myself also an author. I have self-published many, many books. I have published young adult fiction, poetry, and romance. And I'm also currently working on a YA horror novel. So I'm not at all thrilled about the kind of rise of ideology. We only want this sort of books submitted to us by agents. I have had a look and it is really, really annoying and exhausting. So please, Lisa, why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that comprehensive introduction, and thank you so much for having me on the show today. So, yeah, I started, Pens and Poison because I really saw a big gap in terms of what was happening both in kind of academia and the publishing world. So I have always just loved literature, have always wanted to study literature. And this, I think, started around 2014, 2015. And I happened to be a freshman back then at Columbia University. And when I got to Columbia, one of the things that I noticed was that the sort of literary tradition, in the way that I had always understood it, sort of asking these big questions about, what makes us human, talking a little bit about, the really important facets of human nature, asking, what is love? How do we overcome the fear of death? These questions that are fundamentally embedded in literature had almost completely disappeared from the Literary Academy and the way that literature was studied in these sorts of spaces. And what had replaced it was these sorts of ideologies that were primarily about, gender and race and colonialism and all these things that maybe we would associate today with sort of the progressive left. And it started to really affect how literature was being taught and how literature was being presented to students in the English department. And not just the English department, I think it has seeped into so many different disciplines, but certainly it is quite bad in English. I've always wanted to be a professor and a writer. Those were sorts of my aspirations. And I was in my sort of master's program at Columbia, and I realized halfway through that I can't do any more of this academia because there is basically no literary study left in the academy. It is very, very politicized to the point where everything is just kind of a culture war. And so I withdrew from academia, decided, okay, well, I'll just pursue my dream of becoming a writer then, and very quickly encountered the same thing in the publishing world where only certain stories were being published. I just had a piece yesterday that I ran on Pens and Poison where I talked about sort of the soft censorship problem in the publishing industry where we don't necessarily publish certain topics anymore because so many publishing professionals are averse to reading about those topics. Many of the topics that publishing does not like today is anything to do with conservatism or religion. Those are two kind of big ones. So there's almost a soft ban on authors who are writing about these topics. And it becomes notoriously difficult for so many authors to break through who don't share these sorts of progressive sensibilities. And on the other side of the aisle, you have these progressives writing about basically anything. And because so many publishing professionals are coming from this sort of progressive left wing, from departments like, the English department at Columbia University, they tend to relate to these sorts of stories that have these sorts of progressive sensibilities. So we see kind of an increasing number of books with far leftist messages being published today versus, books that, again, approach literary study from this sort of humanistic standpoint tend to get sidelined in the publishing industry. So I think it's a big problem that affects us beyond just academia as well, because the publishing industry affect the sorts of books that get on our shelves, and in many ways dominate the sort of literary conversation. And we do have a big reading crisis, and I certainly don't think that this wokeness in the literary world is necessarily helping that.
Yeah, well, you have firsthand experience, and I do feel quite sad that this is not just your experience, but doubtlessly the experience of many. And when I came across your video, I was just thinking, this is just terrible. This is why we need to keep speaking out against this, because I think it's very bad that, as you said, the history of literature is about, talking about the human experience, and I think this is a fundamental of art. And there's nothing wrong with, talking a bit about race or culture or gender, but I know you, from what I understand, you seem to be more interested in classical literature. So I'm a big Stephen King fan. I've read some classics, mainly 20th century classics. And in It, which is one of my favorite novels, there's a section where one of the characters is in his English class, and he literally says, in a good story, politics, culture, history, it should just come out naturally. Why can't you just let a story be a story? And this is in like the 1980s. So imagine, this is not just now in 2026. This has been going on for decades. And it's doubtlessly because of the rise of people like Judith Butler and, Derrida, Marcuse, or whatever, all these crazy nut jobs who basically wanted to indoctrinate young people and make them believe that everything is offensive instead of actually tell interesting stories.
That's right. That's exactly right. You mentioned some very prominent names there who, feature in English department courses. And yeah, this has been happening basically since the 1960s. You had, the kind of big progressives coming into the academy. Part of what happened, especially in America, was that during the McCarthy era, so many Marxists were just barred from holding positions really anywhere else in society. So they were welcomed with open arms in the academy. And so you had this just flood of progressive thinkers infiltrate English departments and other sorts of humanities departments. And they brought with them their sort of postmodern ideologies. That's your kind of Jacques Derrida, the Frankfurt School, your Marcuse's. They had a really big part there as well. And, those guys were maybe talking about society from a little bit more of an abstract perspective, but then you had the sort of next generation of postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault and Judith Butler start to apply these sorts of broader ideas to the specifics of race and gender and colonialism and class and Marxism and all of this. And then that eventually seeped into the literary academy. So yes, by the 1980s, it was already getting quite terrible. There's this book published in 1987 by Alan Bloom called The Closing of the American Mind. And it essentially talks about everything I talk about today. And that was, again, 1987. So it's gotten worse. Back then, I think it was primarily this sort of moral relativism that started to exist in the academy. Today, it's really gotten to the point where these authors, these professors are talking about race and gender in Shakespeare, and there are those themes in Shakespeare, of course, but when you make that the predominant focus of literary pedagogy, that is when you start to move away from these sorts of bigger ideas, and that is, I think, how you divide a society rather than bringing its members closer together.
No, I really agree with you. I was just thinking because I have enjoyed some books like To Kill a Mockingbird, classic, right? Or Native Son by, what's his name? Richard Wright. I always get him and James Baldwin mixed up for some reason. But yeah, there were some really, really interesting African-American writers who were writing about stuff specific. But I think they were still trying to tell a story. And it's as if what they were talking about was very serious because they were going through genuine problems. And it's almost like what they were talking about then now has become completely crazy. Now it's become it's gone almost because they were still trying to tell a story, but now it's gone from we're talking about legitimate issues to, everything is racist. And we've got these people Robin DiAngelo, and I don't know, it's all just a bit of a mess, really. So yeah, I have to agree with you. There's a difference between wanting to discuss legitimate injustices and actually doing it well. Like you're writing a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, which is actually about racism, and it's done so well. Or The Help as well. I haven't read The Help, but it's a great movie. The difference between that and making that the entire sum of literature.
Yeah, one of my favorite books actually, it's called Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And it's this beautiful novel about, race essentially, and kind of the experience of the African American community back in the 1930s. And that was, again, a very kind of serious, touchy topic that I think a lot of authors addressed very well. But what I like about the book is that it, beyond just examining sort of race and gender roles which exist, it also has an overarching kind of human message that examines how these characters interact with one another, that examines something kind of deeper about why is there inequality right now in America from kind of a more almost like philosophical perspective. And I think, and it also tells that good story, as you mentioned, and I think that's why it's kind of one of my favorite books, because it's so adept at handling those themes from sort of this bigger than us perspective, right? There's something larger than just, let's just sit around and talk about, race and gender. There's a fundamental story, and this sorts of seeps into our experiences versus today. I was just talking to a woman yesterday, and we were discussing many of the same topics, and she had brought up that someone had published a book about essentially there was maybe like a meteor or some kind of cataclysmic event at the beginning of the book, and then for the rest of the book the characters just sort of sat around and discussed kind of race and ecofeminism around a dinner table, and that was kind of the whole book. So it seems that at the expense of telling a good story and creating very believable characters, now it's just this outpouring of ideology. You have I was reading, I also wrote a piece about this new book that everyone's reading, Yesteryear, about this kind of trad wife who travels back in time, and the main character is just insufferable because she's not a character. She's essentially just a list of all of the assumptions that the author has about a particular race, a particular group of people. And it comes off as just completely two-dimensional. And it's clear that she's never actually done her research on what she's critiquing. And it's very self-righteous. And I think that is maybe the characteristic of a lot of books being put out today, is kind of these self-righteous rants at the expense of telling a good story, at the expense of developing deep characters. And so what you have is essentially a series of novels being published today that would very much resemble, I think, propaganda. And that saddens me as someone who, is a lover of great literature.
Yeah, that sounds less like they're telling a story and more like they're just writing a polemic. And the thing is, right, because I'm obviously very into politics myself. I have been for many years. And as someone who's doing creative writing, is published books, there is obviously you need to walk a balance between telling a story. And I think if the story is good, like, you've mentioned this on your channel, 1984 and Brave New World, they're obviously highly political novels, but there is a story in there. And Brave New World is a fantastic novel. I think, a good story, the hallmark of an interesting story is that I keep looking here because my bookshelf is right next to me, but there's a hallmark of a good story is that it's not just a bunch of women sitting around a dinner table yapping about the patriarchy. I did see your Instagram post where you talked about Yesteryear. I haven't read that. I actually don't think I've read any like really, really recent books, but as in published within like the last 2-3 years. But I will say though, because I actually do enjoy contemporary literature. So, for example, I actually have read 2 of Sally Rooney's books. I've read Normal People and Conversations with Friends. I actually really enjoyed them, but it is a bit, you can see obviously very clearly she's a Marxist, she's a feminist, whatever, and the characters go on and on about this. But I guess for me, I found them quite interesting, so I can understand why people don't like those books though, because also there's a bit of, one could say that there's a bit of pretentiousness in like her whole approach. Is this, I'm so much better than those people because I'm so progressive and open-minded. But I don't know. I think that there was, yeah, personally, I did enjoy the stories, and there's been some very good books, like, for example, Little Fires Everywhere. I actually thought was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. I also like, there's a book called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. I'm not sure if you've heard of that one, but that is not, yeah, that's not really ideological. It's more about like mental illness, and I thought that was fantastic. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of good modern books. I don't really have this view that like all modern art is terrible. I think there's always been, Pulp Fiction or B movies, but I definitely agree that the rise of, wanting to make everything be through a political lens, like there's some books like you probably heard of like The Power, Vox.
Yeah.
Tried to read The Power several years ago. I really couldn't get into it because, again, like I have no issue reading a book that comes from an ideology that is different from mine, but it has to be interesting. And I just started. I was like, I can't get into this. But I don't know. Do you then genuinely not like any contemporary literature at all? Or have you?
So I think my other issue with contemporary literature, it's not just the ideology, it's the writing style and the depth. And actually my primary issue with Sally Rooney is she has this very minimalist writing style. And what that has done is it's created an entire generation of novels, because the way that publishing works is that there's one novel that's a hit, and then everyone else tries to essentially emulate that novel. So everyone today is writing in this kind of hyper minimalist style. And I think what that's doing is also dumbing down the sorts of books that we consume. And it goes hand in hand with the ideology. If you can write, it's a lot easier to write in the minimalist style than it is to continually sustain a series of long sentences, right? It takes a kind of a master of the written word to be able to write many long sentences and to execute them in a good way. And Sally Rooney is sort of the opposite of that. She writes these sort of very, very short sentences. They're very clipped. You almost feel like you're reading a picture book in a lot of her works. So that's actually my bigger issue with Sally Rooney, is that she's ushered in this sort of erroneous belief in the publishing world that short sentences are always better. And again, if you read classic literature, it's very different. And you start to see night and day, even 20th century literature. I think after Hemingway, you have these sorts of short sentences, but especially a lot of the sort of writing style that you see in classic literature allows for sustained emotional depth, allows for kind of exploration of interiority that these short sentences just don't get across in the same way. So my kind of bigger issue is that we're sacrificing depth, we're sacrificing backstory just to kind of say a couple of things that are trendy. And that's why if you are an author who holds the correct convictions, it becomes a lot easier to get published regardless of writing quality, because anyone can write a series of 10-word sentences. It's a fairly easy thing to do. Versus it's a lot harder to kind of develop your own voice, to write in this sort of recognizable style. So what you're seeing is just these series of kind of mediocre authors. They're not particularly good writers, but they've been taught in maybe a workshop to adopt this sort of literary minimalism. That's, again, fairly easy to pull off. And then what they do is they use that minimalism to then imbue their work with ideology. And then what happens is that style becomes sort of the dominant, recognizable style in the publishing industry. And everything that sort of veers off of that, or anything that sort of doesn't say the right things about race and gender and whatnot, is essentially discarded. So I think there's part of that is this kind of stylistic capture. And I think it's difficult for the general public to sniff it out. In the same way that, if I'm watching a movie, I'm not a director, so I'm not picking up on the sorts of nuances of, how a film is put together. Versus I have friends who are, who've worked in kind of film production or who've made films themselves, who, when they're watching a movie, they'll talk about, this cinematography is great, or, the director is doing something really cool here. These are nuances that I, as a non-film person, don't pick up on. In the same way that, I, as a writer, I pick up on these sorts of nuances in literature that I think kind of escape the general public, because unless you're sitting there kind of writing your own work, or unless you've studied the history of literature from, Homer to Toni Morrison, it's very difficult to see what's going on stylistically. And I think that that's also a problem that not that many people are talking about, because again, it's not as apparent as the ideology.
Yeah, you said a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, I think also we should distinguish, and it's an annoying distinction, but genre fiction versus literary fiction, because I would say that, for example, in certain books like thrillers or crime novels, shorter sentences are quite common. It's funny actually because my dad's also a writer. He's obsessed with short sentences and short stories. Some
Sure.
people like that because if you're writing, for example, a fast-paced novel, as opposed to something like Lolita or The Catcher in the Rye, you need to actually having shorter sentences is good because it creates tension. However, I think if you're talking about, say, literary fiction, which someone like Sally Rooney, I would say, writes, aims to write literary fiction, I can understand that. I don't remember the books, but I can understand the point about maybe the style being quite, as you said, quite minimalist, quite simple. I mean, I don't know. Have you ever read Zadie Smith?
I have read Zadie Smith. She's
Yeah.
again, she's maybe from a little bit of an older generation of writers. I'm not the biggest fan of her, but I think she, pulls off her writing in a style that we wouldn't see today, because so much of it has become kind of captured by this sort of smaller sorts of sentences. And I do agree that it's dependent on genre. Again, yes, thrillers, of course, you're going to have a little bit of a different writing style, because the point is maybe not to explore the kind of craft of writing. The point is to tell, a thriller story. So I think, but the issue is specifically in literary fiction. And I've been examining literary fiction, and it's the same sort of narrator over and over and over again. It's the same sort of short sentences. It's the same sort of mode of telling a story. There are no rooms for kind of literary asides. There are there's no opportunity to give characters depth because of this sort of writing style. And if it were just, one mode of writing, I could understand that, but it has become basically the dominant mode of telling a story. That, and the other thing in vogue today is the sort of present tense first person narration, which I think also precludes the possibility of literary depth, because you're constantly in the motion, in the story, versus the past tense. What it allows you to do is have a little bit of distance between the story that you're telling and sort of the moment now. There's not as much of an emphasis on immediacy. So I think the past tense just, again, allows for a little bit more literary depth, and this sort of obsession with first person present tense narration, I think, is very much predominant in literary spaces today. And again, if it were just one mode, that would be fine, but it's almost overtaken so much contemporary literature to the point that it is really getting to be quite a problem.
So it sounds like what you really want is nuance in writing, and what you generally seem to be seeing is that there is a lack of nuance in literary fiction. I think On Beauty by Zadie Smith is a fantastic novel, and I think that she's a good example of, as you mentioned, she's older generation, because she is, again, quite, from what I understand, quite left wing, but I think, because I've only read two of her books. On Beauty, Swing Time, I read, it was okay. It was okay, but I thought On Beauty was incredible because I don't know, I think it had a very, very good story. It's a simple premise, the guy having an affair, and then but I don't know. I guess I understand what you're saying. I mean, I'm just trying to think, because I'm looking at the books on my shelf and trying to think about. I think that also this came into my head as well, because a lot of people are becoming more like, attention span is getting shorter because of, TikTok, Instagram. It's almost like people want McDonald's instead of gourmet cuisine. So as we know, like, I'm not sure how old you are, but when I was about 12, Twilight became the massive craze. Everyone was obsessed with Twilight. And then when I got a bit older, it was 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey are like ridiculously subpar, but they sold well. So I think that I wonder if agents are more primarily interested in marketability and in what's going to sell, as opposed to, I just want to write a really cool, well-written story and play around with the craft and stuff. I mean, I don't know, perhaps that's what a lot of the issue is here.
Yeah, so There's that, but within literary fiction, I think it's getting to the point where they don't care about marketability. Someone actually on one of my posts yesterday had commented that the publishing industry relies on just a couple of books to make them money, and then everything else they can sort of just put forth whatever ideology they want to put forth because they sort of know it's not going to make money. So they have to have these course of couple bestsellers that's going to bring in the cash. That's fine. A lot of the times now they're relying also on celebrity memoirs to do so,
Yeah.
which are not written by celebrities themselves. So you have that, and then everything else they publish based on kind of personal taste. So you have essentially these sorts of literary agents, editors who are putting forward a lot of different books based on whatever it is that they're relating to. And especially over the past, I would say 5 years since COVID, it's gotten to the point where even literary fiction has to be this sort of TikTok style. I mean, again, this book yesterday, it was written by a TikTok influencer. So it tackles the TikTok themes. It's written in the TikTok style. The sentences are very self-righteous. They're very short in many cases. And so what you have is just an entire generation of literary novels that start to sound increasingly commercial because we, again, live in the TikTok era. And then on top of that, they carry these sorts of leftist messages because those are the sorts of messages that agents want to see. So I'm very skeptical of this narrative that, a serious literary novel isn't going to sell. Because I think that, I have an audience I have quite an audience on Instagram, and these are people who love classic literature. I know for certain that there are at least 100,000 of them out there, and there have to be more that I haven't yet found in my sort of corner of the internet. And every day, I get messages from people saying, I can't read contemporary literature because it's just, it lacks the sort of depth of classic literature. I want to read contemporary literature because I want to also think about contemporary problems in the way that, these sorts of authors 100 years ago were thinking about the problems of their time. But I can't because it's just so in your face, and none of the characters are memorable. And all of that sort of boils down to, I think, the disparity between what the publishing industry thinks people want to read and what an increasing number of readers actually do want to see in the contemporary publishing world. And, I do think that it's a little bit unfortunate that we've gotten to the point where one has to come at the expense of the other, because I think there's certainly room for both.
I do wonder as well. I was just thinking this as you were speaking. Self-publishing. Now, this is going to shoot myself in the foot because my books are all self-published, but I do wonder because I self-published some young adult novels, and then I published poetry, and I took a lot of time because obviously if you're writing a book you want to spend time and effort on them. And then I decided to embark on writing a romance series, and romance is not my main genre. My romance books, so most of my books published are actually romance under Diana Vale. I put out 15 of them within 2 years, and they're all short novellas. They're not, I wouldn't say all my work is terrible, but they're not brilliant. They're not as good as my other books, which took like several years to write. They're, commercial fiction, right? Because I was writing them with the goal of selling them. And I went on Amazon. There's an overwhelming amount of books. I think a lot of them are self-published. Some of them might not be, but they're all similar. They're like romance. They're usually romance or romantasy, fantasy, paranormal. There is a huge market for this kind of fiction. And there's some author I found, I'm not going to say this person's name, but I remember reading the book and looking at it. She sold a lot, and I was like, wow, this is so bad. And I was thinking, well, I could write a book that's really crap and just sell it and make a bunch of money. I whacked out something within 2 days and published it. It's okay. I mean, it's not, because it's when you think about it, like that could maybe be a downside of self-publishing, because anybody can just publish a book and it's not going through the kind of strict guidelines. I mean, obviously there's a good side to it. So if you want to publish your own work, anyone can put their work out. I've obviously put a lot of work out, but then I guess the downside is there might be a drop in quality. Like, for example, some of my books, which I would say are of quite fairly high quality, are very different to my romance books, which I would say are just, fun, light, easy commercial reads. And that does make me wonder if, there is just an overarching drop in literary quality now because the market is so saturated. And I'm not sure if you know this, but women tend to read more than men. And the most popular genre in the world is romance. And romance is, there's probably some really, really highbrow romance, but there's also a lot of, smut. There's romantasy, fantasy, and it's all this kind of, I don't know. I mean, again, I don't want to come across as like, I know people do enjoy those books, and I'm sure there's a lot of, fun, well written books. And, Sarah J. Maas, I haven't read her, but, I'm sure she's fun. But I guess the issue is there just because you have this saturation of these sorts of books, is that generally just lowering the overarching quality of literature, not just in literary fiction, but across the board, really?
Yeah. So one of the things with the sort of romance thing that you mentioned, that there's absolutely that where so many different authors of romance fiction are just essentially pushing out books because readers are craving these sorts of romance novels. They're craving books that have a lot of depth, lack the depth to them that these sorts of literary fiction novels will have. But I think one of the really, really interesting things is that with romance fiction, it's not pretending to be this sort of deep, whatever. It really is just there to entertain. So I think there's that, but I do think the demographic that's reading these sorts of romance novels is different from the demographic that's reading these sorts of literary fiction novels. So they're almost two different sorts of markets. I was actually speaking to a young woman who used to work in marketing in the publishing industry. And one thing that she said that really astonished me was that the publishing industry does zero market research. So they don't know who they're selling to, and they only understand their audiences based on the sort of audiences that previously bought certain books. So the other interesting thing that's happening is that there is a conflation of, I think, the sort of person who would read a romance novel and the sort of person who would read a literary fiction novel, which tend to be completely different sets of people usually. And there's going to be some overlap. And then what's happening is that they're trying to market these sorts of literary fiction books to the sort of person who would read a romance novel. And then on top of that, there's an entire market that's completely untapped of, again, these people who I think these are probably the market of probably my followers, right? Of people who want deep contemporary literary fiction, are unable to find it. So don't buy books today as they are currently published, but would buy books if they had something else. And when you're running a company, I run a business. One of the things you want to do is you want to conduct that market research to find out what is the untapped market. What is the market you have not yet been selling to that would be a potential customer to whatever it is that you're trying to sell. And so what happens is that these sorts of big publishing houses, they don't do the market research. They don't know who they're selling to. They conflate the literary fiction with the romance people. And then they also don't realize that there's an entire untapped market of people who would buy the books. And so you get these bizarre novels that are marketed, that think the romance market does well because they know what they're doing there. But because that formula works, they're not as willing to experiment with other things. And so there's this sort of, people talk about this risk aversion in the publishing industry. And the same thing is happening with Hollywood, right? Is there's this sort of risk aversion with the sorts of films that Hollywood has been putting out, and that's been hurting them. And people have been criticizing Hollywood, I think, more vocally than publishing, because just more people are watching movies than read books. I think most people are, to a certain extent, sort of dissatisfied with the Oscars over the past couple of years. And so you see now a couple of films that Hollywood is starting to put out that's a little bit more experimental, that takes some risks, because audience members have started to push back and have said, hey, stop making the same movie 400 times over. We want we want art. And so that's why I think it's kind of important to push back on the publishing industry as well, because the more people who say, hey, what are you doing with these sorts of books, the more I think diversity of novels we'll see on our shelves.
Yeah, I mean, the Hollywood thing is interesting. You know, a lot of people talk about this. I mean, I don't really bother with like the Marvel movies. The Disney remakes are just terrible. I will say though, I saw Disclosure Day recently. I thought it was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. But that's, Steven Spielberg, he's like obviously got a big back catalog. The new Devil Wears Prada movie, I enjoyed it. I mean, it's not a fantastic film objectively, but I thought it was fun. Yeah, I mean, it does depend, I guess. Again, it's well, I can see where people are coming from on this. I mean, personally, like, I don't think most people are like me because I actually tend to read everything. Like, my favorite books include Stephen King, but also Lolita, or I really like Catch 22. I'm a big fan of Sylvia Plath's poetry, The Bell Jar. So, I'm not really someone I probably do read fairly widely in terms of genre. I don't have one genre I like, but it makes sense that certain people will be geared more towards certain books. I also wanted to say as well, because I want to ask you about this, but I just want to say, so I know someone who did recently get traditionally published, and this person is a white heterosexual English male, and he's got a lot of writing experience. He's just a normal regular guy, and from what I gather, he doesn't really have any massive opinion on politics. He's got a channel, and I think his book is, from what I understand, literary fiction. It's mainly about. It seems more like what you're talking about, and it talks a lot about death. It's kind of talking about the human experience. So he got published, and I asked him whether or not agents have a political leaning, and he honestly said he doesn't know much about that. And he said to me, "Look, agents are largely looking for a book they can really believe in, a well-written story that will sell and find an audience for." And they always say, they want a hook within the first 3 chapters, and he sent his book to 20 different agents. So I don't, I mean, yeah, I can understand absolutely that there's a lot of agents out there who are like, we want own voices, we want queer lit, we want feminist lit. But I also, I'm sure there are, agents out there who will just take on a book they think is just really good and also really marketable.
So I've heard that the UK is a little bit better
Okay.
in terms of agents, and just mainland Europe is also a little bit better. Because I've seen some sort of books coming out of Europe that have been good over the past couple of years. So it seems that I've talked to, I have a friend who lives in London, who's a writer, and he's also been sort of telling me that, yeah, the UK is a little bit more amenable to these sorts of, more contemporary, deeper works. So I would maybe think that I would be curious to see, does he have you mentioned he has a YouTube social media?
Yeah, I'll send you a link to his book.
Yeah.
His name is Ben Reeves. It's called Everything is Beautiful and Nothing Hurts. I mean, I don't know him personally. I just know him through YouTube, but
Sure.
he's really he's been really helpful to me when I asked him questions. And I think as well, like yeah, what you said makes sense, because from what I understand, America seems, not that the UK isn't ideologically divided, but America does seem to be a bit more ideologically divided in a much more extreme way compared to UK and Europe, compared to the UK and Europe. So yeah, maybe that.
And I think having the YouTube also helps. They kind of know that if you have a social media presence, which is part of the reason that I've started doing social media, is because they like that. And I've now had agents approach me since I started my social media, wanting to work with me. So yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, they do just want to sell books, and they are now seeing that, oh, I have a social media presence, so maybe now they think that, oh, now they can sell my books. So there is that. But does that mean that every single author should be an influencer? No, I think that's there's a little bit of a dystopian quality to that thought, I think. And I mean, it used to be that if you got published at a big 5 publishing house, then they would do the marketing for you. Now they're essentially expecting every single author to be an influencer. Since I hit 100,000 followers on Instagram, I've had 5 agents approach me. I haven't even been querying. I've just been sending out my manuscripts because I've had agents now say, "Oh, now I want to work." This has been fairly recent development, so I'm still waiting for them to review the manuscripts. But it really is interesting that it's 2 of the agents actually I approached with the same book 2 years ago, and they completely ignored me. So it's interesting that it seems to have less to do with the quality of the book and more to do with just, can I sell this or not? And I guess the social media is a signal that they'll be able to sell it in some way.
Yeah, I mean, this guy doesn't have a big platform. I think he actually told me that because he won some writing competitions that helped him a lot. That's actually how he was able to get an agent. I mean, I know he's got a lot of writing experience. I also wanted to ask as well, are you personally still planning on becoming a traditionally published author despite all of this kind of progressivism in the literary world?
So, I mean, if I can, I would like to. If I have the kind of backing of Penguin, whatever, it'll definitely help to sell books. That's just, again, the reality of the world we live in. I do have agents approaching me now. I haven't been doing actually any querying. I haven't been reaching out to anyone because, I guess I don't need to anymore. I have so many people kind of approaching me, and I'm fairly optimistic that, with 5 agents, maybe one of them will like the sorts of stories I write. I do have actually a meeting with a literary agent for next week, so we'll see how that goes. I was just talking to a woman yesterday who was traditionally published back in I want to say 2012, and had a notoriously difficult time getting her second book through. She was published with Macmillan, one of the big 5 publishing houses, and no one wanted her second book. And clearly she's a good writer if Macmillan picked up her first book, and her second book was about 9/11, and so she just couldn't sell it. Nobody wanted to publish it, and it was obviously I think a very well done book, and she wanted to get it out for sort of it'll be the 25th anniversary of 9/11 this September. And she just had no interest from anyone in the literary establishment, and worked with kind of 2 very big literary agencies, some of the biggest, most successful literary agencies, and no one wanted to publish her book. And she ended up just starting her own press because she said, listen, this is ridiculous. So, I do wonder, once I get into that pipeline, even if I do, these agents are reaching out to me, even if I do sign with one of them, how difficult then it will be for an editor to pick it up, because it's not just getting a literary agent, it's like getting an editor to acquire the book, and then the publishing house has to kind of sign off on it and back it. So I wonder if there'll be that, and I haven't gone through that yet, so I don't have experience to share yet, but I will keep everyone posted on
honestly though, it does. I mean, I am quite I guess because I know this person personally. He doesn't have a big platform, and he did get published, but my biggest concern, which I'm sure you might understand, because I really my dream was always to be traditionally published, and I started self-publishing when I was 21, mainly because I just wanted to put my work out there, but I didn't think about it. I wasn't thinking about, I want to make money. I just wanted to put out my books because I was always writing, and I was writing these stories. And, my books, like so 3 of my books, I would say maybe more so 2 of them, deal with very heavy themes like mental illness and abuse and very, very serious things. And they're young adult fiction as well. But I have my most recent published novel was published 3 years ago. And it's called Tic Tac Toe, and I really wanted to get that traditionally published. And it is literally an anti-woke novel. It's basically a neo-progressive dystopia. It's a massive critique of, cultural Marxism. It depicts a kind of dystopian society. And it took me several years to write that book. I did many rewrites of it. And I remember, the editor, they said it was really strange. And I think actually one of the editors, because I won this award for one of my other books, so my prize was to get this book edited free of charge. And I think the editor, he didn't really resonate with it. I get the sense, because that book, that's my only novel that was explicitly political, and I'm coming from an anti-woke perspective. I mean, I wouldn't even, the funny thing is I wouldn't even class myself as particularly right wing. I would say if anything, I'm heterodox left. I'm probably center left or old school liberal, but so I really wanted to get that traditionally published because I thought it might be unique and fun, but I was actually advised against that. And I guess my concern, because I'm working on a book right now, it's young adult horror. it's not ideological. My concern is like because of my name and my platform, even though my platform isn't necessarily huge, like will the agents be reluctant to work with someone who has a whole channel and Substack dedicated to anti-feminism and anti-wokeism? And I don't know. That is something that I've been concerned about. Like, I guess the only workaround I could think of that would be if I were to get an agent one day, maybe use a pen name because I wouldn't be opposed to that. But it is a big concern, you know. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but this idea of agents prioritizing, you know, ideology over story and being so obsessed with politics, it really makes me a bit nervous, actually.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I certainly ran into that problem. I've had two agents make offers, and then they mysteriously withdrew. After that, I think I'm sure in both cases they found my social media and just disagreed with something I said. I'm sure that's what it was. I have no proof, but I don't know what would compel a person to, you know, make an offer on a book that they liked and then, you know, mysteriously disappear other than they acquired some new information about my writing. So, but now I have, that was, you know, maybe a year ago when my platform was a little bit smaller. You know, my platform has certainly been growing. Now I have, again, agents reaching out to me. And I think at a certain point, it just becomes stupid for them to say no because the platform is so big. And I don't think I'm there yet at the point where it would be a kind of a stupid decision for them to just, you know, reject me. But I think I am approaching the point where they recognize that even if they don't agree with my politics, they would make money off of me and I would sell books and I would probably do well. And so I do think that, you know, social media has its ups and downs, but there's a point at which what you say on the social media matters less than just the size of it. So I would say long term, if you're looking to get traditionally published and you think that, oh, you know, the social medias might raise a red flag, just, you know, grow them as much as possible and then agents won't be able to say no.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, I guess I have thought that as well because, I mean, there's authors as well who have always held contrarian views. Lionel Shriver just came to mind because she's spoken out a lot against wokeism, against sensitivity readers as well. I mean, bloody hell, sensitivity readers. That's something which I used to talk about a lot because I used to be so I don't know if you know AuthorTube on YouTube. It's kind of like a subsection of YouTube. I mean, I was quite actively involved in that. I still have my channel was like really small, like smaller than it is now, but I would talk to different authors and I did see there were authors saying things like, oh, you know, cancel J.K. Rowling and getting into arguments over things. And there was this one author, I'm not going to say her name, but she basically, I have her book, right? And I really enjoyed the book. It's a young adult fantasy novel, but she literally made a 20-minute video talking about how she paid like 3 sensitivity readers, and you can see the overt ideology, the overt like woke ideology in the book. And it's a shame because I actually think it's a very good YA fantasy novel. It's like she really didn't need to hire somebody to make sure that her transgender character was not portrayed offensively. And you just think this is probably an incredibly insufferable person. This is the kind of person I just would not want anything to do with at all. You know, and this person, you know, she's traditionally published. I mean, she's got a platform. Her platform is not massive, but she's got a platform. And unfortunately, you know, agents want people like that because they're going to be like, oh, you know, she, her, I'm this, I'm that, blah, 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 blah. And it's just very, very tiresome. So, yeah, I don't know where I'm going.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, I think again the woman I was speaking to the other day about who'd gotten traditionally published couldn't get her 9/11 book published. She had her first book come out right when Trump got elected the first time in 2016, and she didn't say anything about the election because she was like, well, like this is not relevant to me, right? This is whatever. I'm a writer, and so the publishing house pulled the marketing from her book because she didn't have like an author statement about, you know, oh, you know, this is terrible and whatnot. And I think there's definitely some of that, and I do think that it's a little bit ridiculous that is going on in the publishing world, that they will sort of promote your book, they'll get behind certain authors who meet certain identities or certain ideologies, and that to me is a little bit disappointing.
It is disappointing, and I think there's a lot of pressure as well on modern artists, not just authors, but actresses, singers, whatever, to say Black Lives Matter, to say, Me Too. It's really, really annoying because I'm sure there are plenty of people who don't want to say anything about any of it at all. They just want to, like, I'm an artist. I'm not going to talk about my political views. I mean, I'm an artist and I'm also political, which is whatever, but I'm sure there are people who just want to write books. I mean, I don't know Leanne Moriarty's political views. I don't know if you know her. She's an Australian author. I think her books are really good. They're really, really simple women's fiction, just nice, comfy reads. And I don't know what her views are on anything, but I don't think I really need to because she hasn't made that part of her platform. So Louise O'Neill is another author that I actually really enjoy her work, and she is a feminist. I actually met her in person because I was 17 when I read her first novel called Only Ever Yours, and it's a dystopian novel, and I actually thought it was really cool. But I've read some of her books, and again, I do like simplicity. I like simple writing because I actually think it's quite. I mean, some books like Lolita I've brought up a few times, which is obviously very not very fair. It plays around a lot with prose, but I do enjoy minimalistic writing. But Louise O'Neill, she has made such a big deal about her political views on social media, and you just start to think, why? I mean, I don't know. It's just tiresome, the idea that there's almost like this whole world of the arts now is just overwhelmingly dominated by people with left-wing progressive neo-progressivist views. J.K. Rowling, I mean, I personally think what happened to her has been just awful. I think that Harry Potter is fantastic piece of children's literature. It might not be the most amazingly written thing in the world, but it's very well written for what it is, for a children's fantasy series. And I think that it's not really fair to just, go on and on about her views. Oh, J.K. Rowling is cancelled because she has this view. How dare she have an opinion? I mean, bloody hell.
The J.K. Rowling thing is so disheartening to me because she's one of my idols. Just Harry Potter was what got me into reading when I was like 6 years old, right? And so I think it changed my life in so many different ways. And I don't think she said anything that insane, honestly. Like she's just fairly neutral, and I think she's always been more progressive, from what I understand on kind of the economic front. So I think it's so absurd that you have these mobs kind of going after you for saying I think very basic things. And I hope that she's doing fairly well for herself. So I think she has her supporters, but it's really sad. Yeah, what's happened to her with that whole thing.
It is sad. I mean, I was actually just thinking as well. I can't believe I haven't brought this up yet, but like Game of Thrones is literally my favorite show of all time, and I think the books are really, really cool, and they definitely are not minimalistic in their style. They're very, very dense, long-winded books, but I mean, George R. R. Martin, again, I don't know what his political views are, but I imagine because he had a lot of experience in the writing world and in the film world before he published Game of Thrones, so maybe that's why he was able to publish that series. And as you mentioned earlier, there are, a minority of authors like your Danielle Steeles, your John Grishams, your James Pattersons, who are, basically carrying the literary world. And I guess, George R. R. Martin, obviously, I mean, he's, basically just completely given up now. But yeah, there's these authors who are able to, because they've got an already established platform, or they know people within the business, so they're able to make a name for themselves. I mean, when I reread It by Stephen King recently, like that book would not get published today because it would be way too offensive. Because it's set in like 1950s and 1980s America, and it deals with, it uses racial slurs. It talks about homosexuality in terms of, people being homophobic. It talks about mentions anti-Semitism. Like, it's a fantastic. I love it. It's like one of my favorite novels, actually. But when I read it, I was thinking, there is no way this would get published today, and that makes me furious. I mean, even Oh, there's so many books from older generations now that would be deemed too offensive. I'm not sure Bukowski would get published now. People would just say, "Oh, he's just an asshole." I mean, even on Bukowski, I wouldn't even say he's technically excellent. I think he's just got a very unique way of writing, and he uses a lot of humor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if a lot of these writers would get published today.
Yeah, I completely agree. I actually had an article that I read on my Substack called "The Great Works of Literature Would Not Be Published Today," and I don't think most of them would be because of these sorts of almost arbitrary rules that have been imposed on fiction submissions. And that saddens me because I think the more kind of rules you put on what can and cannot get written, the more you start to police art. And it's really ironic to me because you have all these people. Just a couple of days ago, people were praising whatever Dua Lipa's banned books library or whatever that was, and they're so obsessed with banned books that things are getting policed, whatever, and then they don't realize that they are literally the ones policing the sorts of literature that makes it on our shelves. So there's a little bit of an irony there. And I think that, to me, I find myself when I'm writing, when I wrote my kind of first novel that I wanted to get out into the world, I didn't know much about the publishing industry, so I just wrote, the novel that I wanted to write. And then when I started to, query that book and realize, okay, there are certain things that I can and can't do. The second novel that I wrote, there were certain things that I wanted to say that I felt I couldn't say. And that as an artist, as a writer, that grates on me in this terrible way that I can't even explain, of like, it's this kind of self-censorship. And, I do think that that's why maybe self-publishing has been the route for so many authors, is because there are just certain things that you can't write anymore, certain things you can't say, even if you are condemning certain, let's say, terrible behaviors. There's certain words that you can't use. You can't show a despicable character in the same way that you used to be. There's this really great novella that I like by Jean-Paul Sartre called The Childhood of a Leader. And it's essentially about a character who traces his sort of rise to fascism, and he becomes sort of a Jew-hating fascist. And the book kind of culminates with them, beating up just this old Jewish man on a street. And it's a very, horrific book, and there are a lot of kind of Jewish slurs being used throughout. And the point of that book is not that Sartre is endorsing that behavior. He's sort of, shedding a light on it. Right. But you wouldn't be able to write a book like that today because it would just be written off as, racist or whatever, even though the point of the book is to show the ill of that racism. So I think there's, again, a certain irony that in order to attack a certain ideology, you have to be able to kind of fully depict it. So it's almost doing these people a disservice that if you, want to fight racism or whatever, you have to show racism, and you're not even able to do that. And so the only thing you're able to do is just these usually self-righteous, like liberal white women sitting in New York talking about racism without actually having experienced racism, because you can't actually show the racism on the page. So the whole thing is rather ridiculous in my opinion.
It is ridiculous. And this just makes me think of the new Hays Code, because you probably are familiar with the Hays Code, but like, for me, wokeism is the new Hays Code. I mean, look, books have always been censored. So D.H. Lawrence was heavily censored. The Catcher in the Rye was banned. But now, like all these, as you say, white liberal women, usually, unfortunately, I mean, it is ridiculous. And it's funny because also my book, Tic Tac Toe, I forgot to mention this as well. It is like condemning, the neo-progressivism, but it's also condemning the far right. And most of the people, actually, everybody who beta read the novel understood that, even people who lean left, apart from one person. And this person is one of the most insufferable leftists I know. It's complicated while I still talk to him. I've known him for a very long time, but he literally just was like, oh my God, this is like the kind of thing Ben Shapiro would write. This is just alt-right propaganda. And he's not understanding the point of tic-tac-toe is that it's saying that the far leftism is bad, but that the alt-right, far rightism is very bad too. And I think most people who read the book will understand that. It's very, very clear. Like, you'd have to be a complete moron to think that the book is somehow pro far right ideology. I mean, this is the ludicrousness of it all, isn't it? Like, we have people, if you say you're anti wokeism or you're anti misandry, they just say, oh, well, you're a far right, even if you're not J.K. Rowling. It is ridiculous, yeah. But we're coming to the end of the stream anyway. And before we close up, I really wanted to ask, what are some of your favorite books and favorite writers? I'm sure you get asked that a lot, but I really would like to close up on that question.
Well, all of my followers know that I'm a big Dostoevsky girl. I read Dostoevsky is my biggest inspiration. My first novel was sort of loosely based on Crime and Punishment. The novel that I'm sort of starting to work on now was inspired by the brothers Karamazov. So I love Dostoevsky. I read almost all of his work. There are a couple of novellas I still have yet to get to of Dostoevsky. He was quite actually prolific, but I would definitely recommend Crime and Punishment and the brothers Karamazov. Those are the two big ones that I really love. And then some of the other non-Dostoevsky books I love. The Sound and the Fury is probably one of my favorites by William Faulkner. And I actually recently found out that Faulkner's biggest inspiration was Dostoevsky, which makes sense. And I think what I love about these two books, or these two authors, is that they're masters of kind of psychological literature. They really understand human beings in a way that I think few authors do. And, I aspire to emulate those authors in my own writing. And I think The Sound and the Fury is just this kind of beautiful portrait of, the downfall of this kind of Southern family. And other than that, there's another book that I really like to recommend. It's called Beware of Pity by a Jewish author named Stefan Zweig. I think Zweig is very criminally underrated in the kind of classic literature world. But I don't know if you know the Grand Budapest Hotel, the film by Wes Anderson.
Oh, I love that movie. Really
inspired by that book by Beware of Pity. So I guess it's claim to fame in our culture, but it's a wonderful book. And yeah, I think those are some of my recommendations.
Cool. No, I've not read Dostoevsky. I've heard a lot about him, obviously. Yeah, I think I'm a bit overwhelmed by the length. Yeah, but yeah. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Check out his shorter books. He has a couple of shorter novels, and then you can.
Okay. I mean, I do find that there's a big difference in the style of older literature compared to, like, when I read, for example, The Stranger, Albert Camus. Like, there's a difference. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like the difference is really, because maybe this is a different view, but I actually find, thinking about it now, some of the older books I've read, I feel like their style is a bit simpler in the sense that they kind of get to the point. Not in terms of how would I explain this? Like, I feel like the story comes across more clearly, whereas if you compare that to, say, Sally Rooney, she does seem to be obsessed with ideology and less with character psychology. And I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure if simple is the right word, but I am just thinking about it now. Like, I don't know, I find that older books, there is a difference. There's a beauty. I think there's a beauty in simplicity. I mean, I actually think that, there's a beauty in not, yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but anyway.
Well, I think there are some authors who do both, who do kind of simplicity and character psychology very well. One doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of the other. Hemingway comes to mind.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's a little bit more difficult to pull that off in the kind of simplistic style, and I do think you have to be a Hemingway level writer to do that well. And most people are just not Hemingway.
But no, I mean, I only read The Old Man and the Sea. I actually thought it was really boring. But
check out The Sun Also Rises. I think it's a little bit of a different read. The Old Man and the Sea is a little bit. It is slow. I think I appreciated it reading it more recently than I did back when I was in high school. So it kind of grows on you, but I like The Sun Also Rises. It's one of my favorites. It's a little bit different.
No worries. Yeah. Actually, I would like to ask before we close up, are there any contemporary novels you've read that you really enjoy, if you haven't already mentioned them in the stream?
So there are some, I think I don't want to say like cut off, but I think there are some novels from kind of the late 90s that I really like. I'm a big fan of Salman Rushdie. who I actually had the pleasure of meeting a couple months ago at a book talk.
Oh,
So,
that's
so excited at that. But he has a new book out called The 11th Hour, which is really really great. And I think The Satanic Verses is also really
yeah.
really fantastic. So he's a big I think contemporary writer that I really enjoy. And again, he's kind of more this like old school writing style. So he's really great. Um, I do like Paul Auster as well. I think he might have just passed away. Actually, yeah, he just passed away 2 years ago. But he had this 2017 novel called 4321. That I enjoyed it. I think it was good. I think his my favorite novel of his is the New York trilogy. It's kind of a series of like three novellas that are usually published together. But 4321 I think is also one of his pretty good books. So yeah, I think those are some of the kind of more, I guess, contemporary reads that I enjoy. I haven't really found anything from like the past 5-ish years. Not that I read that much of it, but I think sort of this before the woke thing started to trickle in, you could still find some good contemporary literature.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to have you on today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This has been wonderful, talking about literature, something I love almost as much as I like to talk about feminism. But yeah, this is The Rational Female, and we will be live again next week on Tuesday, the 21st of July, with Tom Golden at 5 p.m. UK time. So please, if you enjoyed this stream, join us there. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Goodbye.
Yeah.